but I'm so glad to now move to the second part of our day, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we're starting today with my colleague from Poland, Magda. Magda, how do you pronounce your last name?
Wojciechowska.
Perfect. So I have worked so closely with many colleagues in Poland, and I'm absolutely thrilled. But I also said at some point I would try to learn Polish, and it's tough. I can't do that. So I'm just having to acknowledge my limitations in terms of that. But I'm thrilled that Magda is here. I have known Magda for a long time. Back in 2005, we met in Canada when she was at the Qualitatives conference, which is one of the longest running qualitative conferences. It just had its 37th year of running a conference, and like us, had to go online. Magda was there when she was putting together the Qualitative Sociological Research Journal, of which I've been involved as one of the members, one of the reviewers, and that Magda runs as the executive editor, and has done an amazing job. So I love that journal. It's an open access journal that people, if you don't know about it, you should visit it. We have had qualitative sociological researchers from all over the world contribute to that journal, and some very important articles in the past and in the future. So, but today, Magda is going to talk to us about some of her own research, which I love, and I'm so interested to have you hear about the work that she herself has done in qualitative work in Poland. So Magda, I'll turn it over to you. You can share your screen and it'll be fun.
Okay, thank you so much, Tanya, for this kind presentation. I'm really excited to be here. And as you can see from my presentation, today I would like to refer to some practical but also emotional challenges that I faced while doing my research on behind-the-scenes phenomena. And one of my first serious, I would say, research that I recall in terms of a rite of passage dealt with how female escorts see themselves and are seen within their professional context. After having read a bunch of non-scientific articles covering the issue of prostitution, I wished for an actual understanding of the phenomenon as experienced by those partaking in the unknown I wished to study. So to put things short, I was simply curious. And equipped with tricks of the trade that we are often encouraged to embrace regardless of context, I started digging. Just to give you some contextual remarks, in Poland, prostitution is not recognized as a legitimate profession. It is not illegal to offer sexual services in return for financial gain, unlike pimping or forcing prostitution. Still, at the same time, some aspects of the paid sex industry, like operating escort agencies, are tolerated by public institutions. And basically, the striking contradiction between the legal status of and the legal attitude towards the phenomenon reveals some moral objections, but also its behind-the-scenes nature. And it is indeed quite a hermetic universe operating on the fringes of the so-called normal society. Still, I must admit that it was not as much an obstacle to my research as the way women socialized within this normal society perceived their money-earning activity. And the feeling of shame drove most of them to hide behind the judgment-free walls of escort agencies, making them highly suspicious towards outsiders, but at the same time highly dependent on men, both those willing to buy sex as well as those facilitating the exchange at hand. So as you can imagine, it made it even more difficult for a female researcher to get in. And my first idea was to build my research design based on previous empirical endeavors, which I think is quite a normal way to start. Still, at that time, Polish context-specific qualitative studies on prostitution were scarce. And because of that, having no other option, I simply decided to jump into the deep end. And so I made over 100 phone calls to women posting information on the services they provided. Still, to my great dismay, none of them consented to be interviewed. Instead, they told me to find another way in. And basically, so I did. So first, I started reading blogs written by those somehow partaking in the universe of escort agencies. And having deconstructed my imagery, I adapted to the rules imposed by the research setting. And thus, maybe surprisingly, I turned to men who ultimately granted my access to 5 escort agencies. I'm sorry, there was a phone call. When it comes to escort agencies, those are usually situated on the outskirts, firmly away from frequented areas, parking lots, or bus stops. So as a client, you rather take a cab than go there by car. And so I decided to go to the nearest cab stand to seek advice. In this way, I managed to collect some insightful information about how escort agencies operate, but also cooperate with different agents. But I also got something that I did not expect at all. I was offered phone numbers to escorts, ex-escorts, as well as some regular clients the cab drivers knew. They also gave me a piece of advice, and that was find an inside guy who will vouch for you. And so I thought about it and I realized that escort agencies, they may be operating in the shadow economy, but at the same time, those operate legally, even if those are registered as massage parlors or perhaps strip clubs. And because of that, escort agencies would need the same services any other company would need, like electricity, garbage removal, and insurance. And so I called a friend of mine who worked for an insurance company who contacted me with a guy offering such services to escort agencies. And I must admit that he was very reluctant to endorse me at first, claiming that doing so would be seen as unprofessional. Instead, he offered to tell about my research to one of the insiders he knew socially. And well, as it turned out, it was good enough. Sometime later, I found myself sitting in an escort agency office with my gatekeeper and 3 bodyguards. And I must say that this first entree gave me a whole lot of insight into how men support one another in casting those somehow dependent on them into the roles of subordinates. Of course, they were not acting alone, since I took the role of a pet researcher and I simply played their game. So, for instance, I was the only one sitting the whole time. I was referred to as a nice girl and was invited to offer examples of questions I would ask if granted permission to speak with the escorts. So those were some subtle, discursive and interactional scripts revealing the context of my research setting, but at the same time offering some guidelines as to how to act therein. And you may ask whether I felt threatened, perhaps patronized or offended. I did, of course I did, but I expected nothing else. I was told by my gatekeeper that I would be checked to see that I represented no threat for the business. And even though I passed that test, I was not promised any results. What I was promised was that my phone number was to be given to those escorts who would like to share their stories. And I also remember that while we were leaving, one of the bodyguards told me, let's see how lucky you are. And I'm bringing this up because it turned out it was indeed a matter of luck. What I mean by that is that one should never underestimate one's social network. Because at some point of this venture, I was to such an extent focused on the research that it became like the sole subject of nearly every conversation I had. And university colleague, familiar with the research, obviously, introduced me to her friend, an ex-bodyguard, still socially involved in everyday activities of two escort agencies. She did not mention, though, that he was also a sociology graduate, just like me. And I remember meeting him over a glass of beer as he insisted on getting to know each other before scheduling an interview. And this time it was my turn to share my story. So I told him about my research. He simply listened. But at some point he interrupted and he said, well, that's great, but you haven't seen any real stuff yet. So let me show you the backstage. And well, so he did. Only this time I was introduced as his friend, which gave space for constructing different meanings of my presence. And eventually it resulted in seeing me as a potential working girl. So I got in, but while doing this research, I realized that it is one thing to be let in and another thing to become entrusted with the informant's emotional space. And although many women in this study willingly narrated about the physical dimension of their money earning activity, at the same time, they were not so willing to tell me about their experiences. So it really took a while before I was entrusted with, for example, the feeling of entrapment in their bodies that they perceived in terms of symbolical bridge between normality and deviance. It also took a while before I was shown some tangible proof of male dominance their bodies carried. And by that, I mean, for example, bruises or other wounds. And what I'm trying to say is that developing rapport and winning trust is one of the things that we will need to focus on while collecting stories. And so to get into more details, I would like to tell you about my first interview with a woman working and living at the same site. And when I arrived there, she was the one who let me in. There were no men around. We shook hands, she offered me a beverage. But at the same time, I was able to tell that she did not trust me at all because she put on the costume that she would wear in front of her clients. And when she took me upstairs to her room, she said, "This is where I work. Sit wherever you like." And there were two chairs and a bed. I decided to sit on the bed, and she seemed very pleased with my choice because by doing so, I had somehow demonstrated to not be repulsed by how she makes a living. And in fact, understanding other people's concerns and acting accordingly can be of key importance when it comes to doing qualitative research. I also remember one other interactional episode which took place during that very interview. So I assumed that I would be there for like 3 hours. Instead, I stayed there for almost 8. During that time, I had 2, perhaps 3 cups of tea. And at some point, she asked me, "Does this place put you off?" and I was clueless. I didn't know what I did wrong. And the point is that I did nothing. By nothing, I mean that she had the same number of beverages, but she left the room twice, whereas I not even once. Thus, she assumed that I was afraid of using the restroom as courts use. And basically, we can wonder why they decided to share their stories if doing so was such an emotional burden. And one of the answers that I have to that question is that because I was an outsider with different perspective, plus I offered to listen, but also to hear. And for example, during our interviews, during our meetings, we never spoke about prostitution per se, because that was not what we were doing. They told me that they were trying to pay off their debts, provide for children with disabilities, provide for sick parents, escape from abusive husbands. And most of them would tell me that it was not a matter of choice, but that of necessity. And so, well, obviously, what we can see here on the analytical level is perhaps an attempt at rationalizing their money earning activity in front of a stranger, in front of an outsider who might find it disgraceful. Still, before we put our hands on the data, we first need to collect the stories. And that's why developing reports and winning trust is so crucial. I remember that before I was entrusted with their experiences, we first had some girly chit chats about nail polish. We discussed some funny stories about Catholic priests frequenting the place or what happened to my friend's stories, things like that. And all those such stories, which I call empty stories, can be seen as irrelevant. Those provide the informants with a security blanket and also, as I believe, allow us to win their trust. One other thing which is important here is that this woman whom I met for the first time, she gave me a hand in establishing contact with other experts. She also offered her comments on my final conclusions. And I once asked why did she decide to do so? She told me that she never felt that I judged her in any way. So that was it. And one last subject which I would like to cover is how witnessing is different from being told. And I believe that we've all been told that there are no proven tools that can protect us from the effects of exposure to stories of injustice, suffering, and pain. And I was no exception. I knew all that when I first entered the field, but at the same time, I somehow naively assumed that I had the issue at hand covered. Unfortunately, witnessing pain and humiliation when all you can do is keep on watching is not the same thing as listening to stories, even if those stories are very moving, very, very emotional. Like, I remember that when my gatekeeper, the sociology graduate, took me to the escort agency for the first time, I was left alone for a while, just to see what would happen. And since one of the escorts must have assumed that I was a future employee, I was introduced to the rules and offered some very specific tips as to how to work with the clients. And I must tell you that this experience made me realize how it must feel to be somehow, well, deracinated and rapidly confronted with a totally new perception on one's body, a perception now imposing mechanical and automatical sexual intercourse with strangers. On yet another occasion, and personally for me, this was even more shocking and more moving, I witnessed the blood collection procedure. And this is exactly what it sounds like. So it's part of a medical examination by a doctor, usually a gynecologist, cooperating with an agency. Still, those appointments are not held in private. Instead, they take place in a room where women are herded like cattle and which anybody can access. And I remember that one expert was ridiculed as her co-workers found out that she used a piece of sponge to work during her menstruation. She was not able to remove this sponge afterwards, and so being too embarrassed to ask for help, she waited until the examination. And what I'm trying to say is that seeing how a human's body is being transformed into I'm sorry, I forgot about the slide. How a human's body is being transformed into machine. It showed me the depth and the extent of what I was studying. And my first thought was to somehow save those women. But at the end of the day, that is not our job. And so, my feelings of anger and helplessness at the same time resulted in cyclical pullouts of the field, since I needed some emotional space for myself, since I needed to reflect on the next steps that I would take. And basically, I believe that it was necessary because not only the quality of our research, but also our welfare depends on how we manage emotions. And those cyclical pullouts were my way of taking care of my well-being. And just to conclude, I remember being asked on a number of occasions whether sex workers wouldn't like their profession to become a legitimate occupation, mostly for safety purposes. And my answer to that every single time was no, they wouldn't like that. Why? This would help them, some people told me. But, well, here's a thought. What if people whom we see as vulnerable would find such help in terms of making things worse for them? What I've learned during this study is that those women who shared their stories would rather suffer alone than be exposed to a critical social gaze. And they don't want to be saved. They simply wish to survive, to keep on doing their job, to keep on providing for their families. And if there is anything that they wish for, it is the understanding of the fact that what they do is not deviant. For them, it is their everyday reality of work. And I believe that there is one vital thing that we can do. We can retell their stories. We have with the hope that doing so will contribute to that understanding. I don't know whether this will work, but I believe that it is definitely worth trying. And as for me, retelling their stories and seeing how people reacted to what they heard turned out to be one of my coping strategies. It empowered me emotionally, giving me the power to simply go on, to carry on with my research. And that is all from me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Magda. This is really wonderful and interesting research. And it's in that frame of very classic qualitative research that has been done primarily originally in the United States. So it's wonderful to see this in other places, and particularly where cultural differences are there. Can I ask, so was it almost exclusively that the workers were female and the clientele were male?
Yes, that was it.
So, that reminds me in a much different world and not the same presentation, but when I did my field work in Cork in the 1990s, I went into pubs and got asked by publicans what kind of business I was there for, because at the time, women on their own doing that had to be of the profession that you've studied, as opposed to being a researcher. And so often publicans were relieved when they found out I was a researcher. So my question was, did you get asked if that was your, yeah.
Of course, many times. As I told you, at some point, women assumed that I was looking about to be hired there. So I was offered a lot of tips. I was introduced to the rules. I was also told by my gatekeepers that some of the bodyguards hoped that I would decide to work there because it would be good for the business if there is a new girl in the agency. So yes, it happened quite a lot, but I must also tell you that I remember when I was doing this research and I was sharing my conclusions with my colleagues, I was asked, well, perhaps not similar question, but there were a lot of emotions and a lot of excitement regarding that. So many people asked me about things I did not find interesting personally, like how many clients, how much do they make, etc. Few people asked me about those human experiences.
It's an interesting thing when we think potentially you got access in certain ways from being female. If a male sociologist had been in that world, it would have been a very different thing. And it's something that, it is something that I think is relevant in terms of thinking about these things. The one other question that I was thinking about was the liminality of legality that you were mentioning. So I was thinking once again about one of my professors in Canada, Mary Lou Dietz, who worked with the Murder Incorporated in the 1980s and wrote a book called Killing for Profit. But one of the things that she told us when we were postgrads was that she worked out a contract, as it were, about legal issues. So the liminality of legality here, did that mean you didn't have to think about that at all? Because in essence, they had it as publicly legal, but, so there were no questions that you had to deal with that.
Yes, that is true. There were not questions because formally it is legal. Also, as I said, public institutions simply tolerate that. So if there are some controls by the police officers, usually everybody involved is informed about such controls so they can work things out so that it doesn't really look as an escort agency. One more thing, if I can simply add, there was a male sociologist involved in my research who helped me, and for him it was very different. He was able to collect more data from male participants, but it was nearly impossible for him to get anything from female participants. At the same time, female participants treated him as a potential client. So they used some of the strategies they normally go for, and they tried to intimidate him. They tried to make them buy some drinks, things like that. We also got different data from the clients.
It's interesting. It goes back to the classic anthropological husband and wife teams that would go to different cultures. And so I think that does bone for collaborative research again, in terms of thinking about some of these things. But it also means that we are sharing with our research people as well, that you are giving me access to certain things that you wouldn't give my colleagues. And we recognize that. And that is a privilege. that we have when we can do that. So, well, thank you so much, Magdalena.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. And I look forward to reading more about your research, and you're going to write a book, right? So, because it'll be one that I want to read. So, and I'm sure many of our colleagues. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya, so much. Thanks.